This is what will determine the score. So when you're speaking, how can you be able to articulate yourself correctly? How can you be able to articulate yourself effectively, especially on fluency? That means the examiner will try and see how do you transition from this sentence to another sentence. How do you transition from this paragraph to another paragraph? And this is very, very important, especially in part 3, but it's also important in all the other parts, part 2 and part 1, but it basically applies a lot in part 3. Now, let's continue. I also listed down to you the different kinds of cohesive devices that we have, and I said we have what we call sequencing, we have what we call addition or additional cohesive devices, we have illustrating devices or illustrative devices, we also have comparing or comparison kind of devices, qualifying or conditional kinds of devices, and contrasting or differentiating. We also call them differentiating kind of cohesive devices. And so I'm going to spend time to actually explain to you sequencing, additional, comparison, and contrasting. Because as some of you know, or maybe some of you that have been in my classes, I always make it aware to you that when you are dealing with questions in part 3, we have 7 kinds of questions. You know, we have 7 kinds of questions. We have the opinion kind of questions. We have the evaluating kind of questions. We have the comparing and contrasting kind of questions. We also have hypothetical kind of questions. We have the past kind of questions. So those are different kinds of questions in part 3. But from my own perspective and from my own experience, the most popular kind of questions you will find in part 3 is contrasting kind of questions, comparison kind of questions, and evaluative kinds of questions. And definitely the 4th one, which is opinion kind of question. Those 4 kinds of questions are very, very popular in part 3. And this is where the importance of cohesive devices come into play. Now, let's talk about number 1, sequencing. So I'm just going to take this one here. I know I'll just use it here. Sequencing kind of cohesive devices. Now, as I wrote here, firstly, secondly, or second, or next. I'm going to give you some more examples. Secondly, we have second. We have, okay, let me just write this down here. We have firstly, we have second, we have secondly. If you have a third answer, you can say third. Actually, thirdly is not correct. There is no word like thirdly. If I may have used that in our class, that must be wrong. We don't say thirdly, we say third. Okay, the same way we don't say oftenly, we say often. So sometimes people make that mistake. So you can also say next. You can also say meanwhile. You can also say now. You can also say subsequently. So for example, you're trying to answer a part 3 kind of question. Now, most of the time I tell students that when you are answering the part 3 kinds of questions, you don't give one answer. Why? Because the part 3 kind of question is what we call the discussion, or more or less a conversation that you're having with the interviewer. So the interviewer will give you what we call abstract kind of questions. And most of you, I'm sure you've had this experience, and I've had so many students who've had examinations and they tell me, oh, teacher, the examiner took a lot of time to ask me questions in part 3. Definitely. Why? Because the examiner is trying to grill you and see if you understand what you're talking about. He's trying to grill you and see if you have a good understanding of the part 2 question, because the part 3 question is related to the part 2 question. So what the examiner will do, he will try and ask you follow-up questions. That is why most of the time, if you ever had this experience in the examination, if you are unable to answer the part 2 question, the examiner will not even bother to ask you the part 3 questions. Why? Because if you can't answer the part 2, you definitely cannot answer part 3. So most of you maybe have come through this experience. They tell you, the examiner asks you a part 2 question, and he feels that you didn't answer it adequately, and he tells you the examination is over, and you come out and you wonder, why did he not ask me part 3? Because maybe he thought, or maybe from his own assessment, he realized that you have no idea about the part 2 question, so there was no need to ask you anything about part 3. Now, so that is the main reason as to why it is important for you to teach yourself or to train yourself to not give 1 point in part 3. I advise at least give 2 points, or you can work with 2 to 3 points in part 3. And that is where the aspect of sequencing comes in. Whether it's in part 3 or whether it's in part 1, the sequencing discourse markers helps you to be able to give points in a complex grammar, in a complex grammar method. Because when we talk about complex grammar consists of 2 things: discourse markers, which is also here cohesive devices, plus the phrases, which is now the sentence. Okay, I don't know what happened here. The cohesive devices plus the sentence. This is what composes complex grammar. So every time you're answering a question, the examiner will see, all right, so let me see, how is this student going to show me the use of complex grammar? So for example, I'll ask you a question. Let me pick one part 3 question here, and let's look at it. Let me just show it on the screen. Now, we have a part 3 question here. When do children begin to have, okay, that's very simple. Why are there more and more differences between children and their parents? Now, such a question as this, you can see it's a question where you can easily be able to give 2 or 3 points, you know. So at this point, when the examiner asks you a question like this, why are there more and more differences between children and their parents? He doesn't expect you to give one answer. And as a smart student, you need to know, I won't give one answer. I'll give at least 2 answers or 3 answers. And another thing that is also important, I have to make sure that for every opinion that I give a valid reason. That's another topic. We'll talk about it later on. But now, how do you begin your answer? So you say, for example, with my own ideas, you could say, firstly, I know as you're looking at this, maybe you have your own ideas. So you can say, maybe firstly, it is caused by the huge age gap experienced in our country. Okay, so you could say this is because, let me put this very well, of the hustle and bustle of city life. So many parents take time before they get children. Okay, so you find that you're trying to say, okay, the first thing that I have in my mind is that there is caused by the first thing that I have in my mind is that there are more and more differences between parents and children because there's a huge age gap. So that's the first question, that's the first answer. So now you could say, subsequently, which is the second one. These differences are caused by the rapid development of technology. Okay, so you say many children are born as digital natives, and their parents are what? Let's say their parents are outdated, so they tend to they tend to have a lot of difference in ideas. So you said they tend to have a lot of difference in ideas. Now somebody's sending a message, conventional. Okay. Sorry, I don't know where I would put the word conventional. Many children are born as digital natives and their parents are conventional. All right, maybe you could say that, or outdated. So they tend to have a lot of difference in ideas. So you see, as a smart student, you have already given your second answer. So you have tried to use a discourse marker subsequently. You've also said firstly. Now you see, for the aspect that you have put in this discourse marker or these cohesive devices, it has brought out a complexity to your grammar, which is very, very important. So that's the first thing that I want to mention. The sequencing kind of cohesive devices, this is how you use them to your advantage. You have to make sure that when you're answering questions in part 3, that you use sequencing kind of discourse markers. Secondly, we're going to talk about additional. Now the rest of these, we're going to look at them later on. Comparison and comparing and contrasting. These are whole new these are full topics that will take quite a time for us to discuss. But we're going to talk about the second one, which is additional. Now, the additional cohesive devices are used to describe additional points or additional reasons. But at this point, I would say additional reasons. Maybe you can mute your microphone so that you don't distract people. At this point, I would say additional kinds of cohesive devices are very important to give additional reasons. Okay. Now, for example, let's look at this question here.